Good morning and welcome, everybody. My name is Zaina Al-Shaib. I'm the Director of Communications here at MEI. Thank you for joining today's On the Record briefing, in which we'll discuss the changing power balance on the ground in Yemen. In recent months, Yemen has emerged as a focal point of rising tensions between Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. In December, UAE-backed fighters took control of several areas along Yemen's southern border, pushing closer to the Saudi frontier. Riyadh viewed this advance as a red line and a direct threat to its security, prompting Saudi-backed forces to move in and retake most of the territory. While the main Emirati-linked group, the Southern Transitional Council, disbanded. How will these dramatically changing dynamics in Yemen impact the country and regional stability more broadly? With us today to answer that question and more is Fatima Abu al-Asrar, a Middle East Institute affiliate and Director of Policy and Research at the Washington Center for Yemeni Studies. We're also very lucky to be joined by Gregory Goss, Associate Fellow at MEI and author of 3 books focused on the Persian Gulf. We were also hoping to be joined by Ibrahim Jalal. Unfortunately, his flight got delayed and he will not be able to join us. So thank you both for joining us.
Thanks for having us, Zaina.
My pleasure.
So as usual, we'll have the Q&A segment during the session. So if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to use the raise hand function here on Zoom. And once selected, we'll unmute you and you could direct your question to one or both of our panelists. You're also welcome to write your question in the Q&A chat box here on Zoom, and I'll read them to the panelists. Let's get started with Fatima. Fatima, you said in a recent article that within days, Yemen's governing and military formation has been restructured in ways not seen since the war began with the Houthi takeover of the north in 2014. Could you please elaborate on that?
Yes, thank you for having me, Zaina, and to the Middle East Institute for organizing this. At the start, in 2014, there was an Arab coalition. Saudi Arabia and the UAE worked together on a unified objective, which is uprooting the Houthis and restoring the Yemeni government. That was the long-stated objective. And now that has quietly shifted. So today, the priority for Saudi Arabia is not necessarily just defeating the Houthis outright, but also preventing further fragmentation of Yemen in ways that directly threaten Saudi security. And that's the fundamental point, is that it needs border control. So what changed in December with the STC advent was authority. I mean, Saudi Arabia drew red lines against an actor that it felt it cannot completely control, which is the STC, and decided that instead of managing a fragmented coalition with different objectives, that it will take a more of a direct role in command and command structure, the architecture of, or the military architecture of the South, that it needed to be folded under it. So we saw political sequences, military, hierarchy and decision-making authority moving upward and outward and toward Riyadh. So this kind of systemic reordering hasn't happened since the Houthis centralized power in the north in 2014. Even arguably before that, during the national dialogue in 2013, when the army was disbanded. This is Saudi Arabia taking full control. So to fold the militias, the security arrangements into direct Saudi oversight, removing, a fundamental partner in the coalition. The UAE was more or less there only through the STC. But it's because of the SEC's action that have become unpredictable. Their statements have also become unpredictable. The Saudis thought that they needed stability of the system on the short term. And it just sort of, really completely shifted the political center of gravity outside of the country. So it's no longer in in Yemen, and it's in Riyadh decisively.
All right. You're a longtime Yemen watcher and analyst. Uh, did you see those changes coming? This drastic shift, did you see it coming or was it surprising?
This was surprising in so many ways. I did not expect the STC to sort of fall out of line. I expected the STC to appeal to Saudi Arabia's emotions and senses to achieve its objectives. So to just, put your foot on the pedal in such a way that you expand and enforce authority, and especially at times where Saudi Arabia was issuing appeals to the STC to de-escalate, it's very important that in looking at what happened in Yemen, is just to realize that this is happening among allies. This is the anti-Houthi coalition. So you don't, not only do you not expect Saudi Arabia and UAE to sort of like have any kind of fallout in that, because I mean, let's be honest, the STC was a project that was contested right from the start, but it was Saudis that gave the STC some political legitimacy through folding them in a process that allowed them to be power holders, shareholders in Yemen's presidential leadership. They actually went from being illegitimate in the eyes of many and at the time of their formation to completely legitimate during the Riyadh Agreement, which tells you that there was no ideological problem between the STC and Saudi Arabia, accommodation that happened solely because of Saudi Arabia, and that accommodation has also helped a lot. I mean, in kind of making people understand what the Southern grievance was. So the SDC had large political capital that Saudi granted. So often we talk about them as a UAE proxy. I feel like that sort of like collapses distinctions. It just oversimplifies. But this was an actor who had a significant control of the South, ability to manage troops and militias in the South and create those militias and sponsor them and have the loyalty, because that's very important. And I think the regional identity has helped in this formation of, the loyalty to the STC, which became a very useful political defense tool for both Saudi Arabia and the UAE. The only problem is that, the timing just was not was timing is of the essence, and this was a moment where the timing was really problematic for Saudi Arabia, given the combustible problems that are happening around the world. Given what's happening, especially in the Palestinian issue, where Saudi Arabia is wanting to see as de-escalate, impose a ceasefire, but also impose its red lines, and then you have a problem with the president of the SDC, who in September quite said that he would be aligned with the UAE and also be open to the Abraham Accords. Um, and that also happened on the back of, have Israel recognition of Somaliland. It took only 4 days from that recognition of Somaliland to Saudi actually decisively attacking Mukalla and saying, that's it, this is out of control. So that moment was misread by the STC. I don't know to what extent was the UAE kind of party to this, because I mean it's just very unclear. It just seems like Zubaydi, Aidarus Zubaydi, the SEC chief, decided to just take unilateral decisions. I mean, I've been talking to people trying to understand like the core of what happened, and it seems there isn't really a clear picture to why the STC actually decided to go that way. I'm not sure if the UAE has really directed him or if it was something that he decided to do on his own. So it's kind of, you know, interesting. But essentially, what Riyadh has done since is that it has dissolved the STC. The delegation that was there decided to dissolve it. You might be in disbelief. The street might still want it, and but Saudi Arabia wants to replace it. Whether that replacement can be effective or not, I think the Southerners are open to it.
All right. Thank you, Fatima. Greg, before we get into the details and talk a little more about the STC specifically and the various players, what's your reading of these developments?
Well, I think Fatima's right in that this was a gamble by the STC, and not an unreasonable one. I mean, as she said, there's no ideological problem the Saudis have with the STC, and historically, the Saudis in the past have supported efforts to divide the Yemens. Back in 1994, when right after unity, when the Yemeni Socialist Party tried to take South Yemen back out of unity, the Saudis supported it. So it was daring and ill-timed, but not irrational, I think, and particularly if STC and Al Zubaydi saw themselves kind of in decline, maybe the UAE wasn't backing them as much, maybe they were feeling more Saudi pressure, try to create a fait accompli. That's me kind of spitballing about what might have happened. As Fatima said, we don't know, but clearly this effort by STC ran against not only the immediate Saudi interest in having friendly forces, if you will, on its southern border, its border with the eastern parts of Yemen, but also a more general Saudi proclivity these days toward not supporting non-state actors, toward emphasizing legitimate governments. And even though the internationally recognized Yemeni government is hardly controls the territory, it is the internationally recognized government that the Saudis back. And I think Fatima was right when we see the Israelis recognizing Somaliland, when we see the issues in Sudan between the RSF, supported by the UAE, and the government in Khartoum. The Saudis are very much these days in favor of state-to-state relations, and they're against what they would see as kind of the Iranian tactic of backing non-state actors. And they kind of see the UAE as adopting what the Saudis feel like is an Iranian strategy of not dealing with states, but rather trying to build up non-state actors. So I think that overall take on Saudi foreign policy put the STC and the Emiratis in a hard place in Yemen. Now, we don't know whether there's any hope of a Yemeni peace process going forward. I'd like to hear what Fatima thinks about this, but the Saudis were certainly, I think, at least pushing that way. There was a meeting in Oman back in the fall of 2025. There are Houthi representatives there and other southern Yemeni group representatives. I think the internationally recognized government had representatives. I kind of doubt that anything good is going to come of that in the short term, but I think that's where the Saudi policy was driving, was some kind of political process between the Houthis and the internationally recognized government, kind of under Saudi umbrella, to get to move things along in a more peaceful direction, more stable direction in Yemen. And of course, the STC moving toward independence would have blown that process up.
Can Iran have the same level of power it used to have in Yemen?
Right. Iran has a significant amount of authority and power over the Houthi movement because you see them um, move exactly the way that Iran wants them to move. They can't fall out of line from what the Islamic Republic of Iran wants them to do. Their talking points, their alignment, it's almost identical. And uh, we can see that at the current time, there's so many opportunities and options for the Houthis to expand, but they can't. They can't expand. They're working they can't take action because they're working very delicately at the moment with the Islamic regime. And today, I saw some signals of escalation, especially around the issue of Somaliland. But I think that it's very convenient because it's such a good deflection point for the Islamic regime. If the Islamic regime in Iran is under threat. Its proxies are usually its first line of defense, and because Assad is gone, Hezbollah is weakened, they have some capacity in the Houthis. I mean, the Houthis are significantly weakened, but Houthis are still issuing threats. So I think that if, for example, President Trump wants to uh, move to threaten Iran directly, Iran has options, and the first one is Houthis taking actions against Somaliland. And it's kind of like a genius move because there is enough opposition to Israel recognition of Somaliland. And basically, it gives this veneer of legitimacy for the Houthis to say, we're acting again to stop Israel from encroaching into this area. We're acting on behalf of the Muslim Ummah. So it gives them that kind of excuse that they've used in the Palestinian cause and makes people more sympathetic to them. So and that's usually Iran's playbook in our area. So I feel that in the way that the relationship is important, but it's important much more maybe symbolically that rather than from a military perspective. If I'm writing an article about this right now, which is what happens to Yemen if what happens to Iran's proxies if Iran falls, if the regime falls. And I sadly, I think it will be an opportunity to weaken even the Houthis further, but the Houthis don't just collapse like a house of cards if Iran is going to be weakened or fall because they have options. Houthis invested in ideological infrastructure in a country in a way that I haven't seen in any other country. They've changed the society 180 degrees. Yemen is completely unrecognizable from 10 years ago. Um, I don't have, if I talk to the new generation and the kids, we don't share the same language. These are generations that are, kind of grew up with the death to America, you know, and violence, so much violence and so much anger that has been harvested by the Houthis. So the ideological part of it, which we've completely underestimated, is the one that makes Iran, and the Houthis and the Khomeinism mentality take root. And it's important to say Khomeinism and not Shiism or Zaydism because none of that is what the Houthis are all about in Yemen. On the issue of Israel, Israel has completely, I mean, to a great extent, weakened the Houthis. It took 12 of their 16 cabinet members. Then that's huge. And the Houthis have been in disarray since. They're weakened, and I don't want to either overestimate or underestimate what happened. But we can definitely tell that Israel has not has weakened them, but I don't think Israel or Saudi Arabia or others are interested in getting entangled in Yemen. They want to contain the Houthis. They don't want to open new fronts. And I think, the problem, the existential problem that we're having is how do we contain the Houthis once and for all? And, there needs to be some kind of conversions on this topic because I think part of the reason and the biggest reason why the Houthis are not contained is because Russia and China and Iran have an interest in keeping them as a destabilizing force in the Red Sea. So sorry, it's a long-winded answer.
No, no worries. Uh, Greg, on the topic of Houthi containment, we're going to remind the audience something that we've mentioned at the beginning of this briefing is that these are cracks in the anti-Houthi coalition.
Mhm.
So, how is the UAE-Saudi rivalry impacting the Yemeni government's position and efforts to end the war, and by extension, also the fight against the Houthis?
So I think the Saudi approach to the Houthis in the last 3 years has been not to fight them, but to negotiate with them. The ceasefire is basically held between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis. When the Trump administration and even the Biden administration before it decided to drop some bombs on the Houthis, the Saudis did not cooperate in that because they wanted to sustain the ceasefire. It kind of gets back to this new approach in Saudi foreign policy, which is very directed toward regional stability as a necessary component of their ambitious economic transformation effort in Vision 2030. Right, the Saudis want to be a hub for trade, for tourism, for the movement of peoples, and you're not going to get the kind of investment they need in if everybody sees the Arabian Peninsula as a war zone, Persian Gulf as a war zone. So I think that that's what's directing the Saudis. Their notion of containing, they failed in the effort to roll back the Houthis militarily. And so their strategy of containment of the Houthis is now based on negotiation. And as Fatima said, the Houthis are a tough nut to crack. They're very ideologically driven, and I don't think the Saudis have any sectarian or ideological problem in dealing with Zaydis. I mean, if we go back to the 1960s, the Saudis supported the grandfathers of the Houthis in the civil war in Yemen. So I don't think that there's an ideological issue on the Saudi side, but there is on the Houthi side. As Fatima said, and I'm convinced of the Houthis are a very ideologically driven movement. They're not simply a movement of Zaydi resurgence. Uh, they are that, but they're not simply that. I mean, they also represent, this Khomeini's view of what Shiism means in regional politics, and they're going to be a difficult player in Yemeni politics and in regional politics for some time, I think. Now, I'm awaiting Fatima's piece on what happens if the Iranian regime falls, because it won't mean the end of the Houthis, but it might mean a willingness in the Houthi decision-making centers to rethink where they are, because without Iran, they lose a lot of economic support, military support, political support. And that might lead to some rethinking of their role in the region, but it would take a big rethink.
Let me stay with you for a second, Greg. Are you concerned about groups like the Houthis, like Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, exploiting what's happening right now in Yemen?
So this has been a hobby horse I've been riding for 15 years. I think that the main geopolitical problem in the Middle East is the weakness of states and the ability of non-state actors to take advantage of that weakness, to establish bases, to recruit, and to allow foreign actors to intervene in the politics of those states, right? That's Yemen, that's Libya, that's Lebanon, that's Syria, that's Iraq. I think that that has been the defining issue in regional geopolitics. Since the Iraq invasion, the United States made in 2003, and certainly on top of that, since the Arab Spring of 2011. So it seems to me that the reconstruction of states is a first step toward a more stable uh, regional picture. Unfortunately, a lot of actors don't want that. For quite a while, Iran did not want that. It's increasingly clear that Israel does not want that, does not want that in Syria, does not want that in Lebanon, does not want that in Palestine. Uh, and to some extent, this is the root of the Saudi dispute with the UAE. They worry that the UAE, in its actions, its recent actions, doesn't want that either, and doesn't want the stabilization, a state-based stabilization of regional politics. Uh, Look, it's not easy to get there. State building is a very difficult thing, but without it, I don't think you get a stable region.
May I add just a small thing on the AQAP front? Just that AQAP is really different. It doesn't necessarily benefit from Saudi, centralization, but it benefits from local governance gaps. So where the SDC was helpful is that, the militias that were under its control, the command structure that was already there, was useful in keeping some measures of security intact. Now, if the southern security structures are in flux, if commanders are unsure who they answer to, that's where AQAP have historically resurfaced. And it's not as a mass movement, but just like as a spoiler, as an opportunist, they're really gangs for hire. They can be, AQAP in particular, can be deployed to cause chaos. So they're opportunists and they operate in peripheral areas. So the risk isn't necessarily that groups are suddenly stronger. It's just that everyone else is temporarily looking inward. And in Yemen, even short periods of political distraction create the space for actors who are very, very good at waiting.
All right. A question for you, Fatima, from Bana Khamis. Given the fragmentation we've seen now, what conditions would actually be necessary for a credible intra-Yemeni dialogue to succeed on the ground? And is the anti-Houthi coalition now way too fragmented to function as a truly meaningful negotiating bloc?
Um, it's usually the question that we keep going back to. For an intra-Yemeni dialogue to be credible, it can't just be inclusive on paper. It has to be anchored on real authority on the ground. And I think this is the mistake that just keeps happening in Yemen time after time. You know, um, there's an agreement somewhere in a hotel, and people come together, and people on the ground set the terms. Representation is usually a huge issue. I don't think Yemenis are living the experiences, actually. I mean, and we're not giving time for these experiences to be lived. Um, it's kind of, I mean, I don't know. It would be like asking a question is like, how do you fix the problems between the Democrats and the Republicans and expecting them to be solved in a conference room, right? And I feel like often we ask these of Yemen just thinking, let's just get them to agree. I think fundamentally what people are looking for is how do we stop conflict now? So lasting solutions should be a conversation that Yemenis have whenever they're prepared to have it, and I can tell you they're not. But really, what we've seen over the past few years is that dialogue that runs over runs ahead of power realities just doesn't go well. Groups are usually invited because they're recognized internationally, not because they can deliver compliance locally, and that's an issue. So, and it's actually a really structural problem. So for me, when I look back and I look at December, and the advent of the SDC and Hadramaut and uh, what happened, I see that dialogue can maybe only work when there is just clarity about who controls security, resources, who can actually have that enforcement on the ground. Now on the anti-Houthi coalition, um, yes, it's fragmented, but I wouldn't say it's non-functional because there's just a hierarchy, and right now there's just a restructuring. So I'm not that concerned. People will defend their land. I mean, the Houthis cannot advance an inch without finding that kind of resistance. And the Houthis, luckily, are not advancing. So I'm really not worried about either the militias or the structures or even, the army being under the command of Saudi because it's usually have been under the command of one or the other. But I think it's the more that there is loyalty to people on the ground, and especially the military figures. If there's respect for the military leaders on the ground, then you find the kind of loyalty that stops the Houthis from infiltrating the army, which has been the problem in the past. And I think I mean, there's a tension here that needs to be resolved, and that Saudi Arabia needs to get ahead of this issue before it, gets out of hand.
All right. Greg, Riyadh was able to mobilize diplomatic backing for its position in Yemen, and that includes engaging Qatar, Oman on the issue, among other countries. Why was Riyadh able to do that?
Well, the Qataris will be on any side against the UAE. I think that presents itself. So that wasn't a hard ask. The Omanis have, of course, particular interests in the eastern part of Yemen, Mahra province. They've been extremely worried about uh, the prospect of control of Mahra province falling into the hands of people with whom they don't have any kind of relationship. I think the Omani elites remember way back in the 1960s when the Dhafari rebellion was an active challenge to the Sultanate. And that was largely backed and supplied through the southern Yemen and through Mahra province. And so the Omanis have always been very concerned about that. And of course, there's the Omani kind of self-conception as mediators in the region. And they were the hosts of this abortive uh, peace process meeting in the fall. I think Fatima is absolutely right. I mean, there's no dearth of meetings among Yemenis, but unless the meeting is among people who actually can implement decisions on the ground, it's just a talk fest. But the Omanis are the masters of the talk fest, and I think that they saw the STC as both a group that they didn't have a relationship with and a group that was going to upset the apple cart on any kind of peace process in the short term.
All right. Um, a question for both of you. We could start with Fatima from Gary Friedman. Gary wants to know disarming, demobilization, and reintegration achieved via the Kosovo Accords can or cannot become relevant in Yemen.
Achieved by
The Kosovo Accords. Would the concept of DDR, disarming, demobilization, and reintegration work in a country like Yemen?
um, did So I have some thoughts about that. I think it's really an important question. If I think the way that the DAR functioned, it worked because several conditions were already in place. There was a clear, end to the war, which we do not have in Yemen. There was a decisive external security guarantor. Um, it, just kind of like critically, the political horizons, the fighters could, you know, imagine themselves entering. I do see some of that in Yemen, but it's not really complete, right? So I don't think we have the sequencing right in Yemen, and that becomes a problem. There is no agreed end state. There's no shared vision of that state that people are going to be demobilizing into, and not a single authority that can really credibly guarantee security once weapons are handed over, if they would ever be handed over. And I mean, disarmament, like this talk about disarmament is not even in the UN vocabulary for the Houthis at the moment. And when you try to talk about it, for some reason, UN envoys just dismiss it, and it's frustrating. I mean, we see this conversation happening in Hezbollah in Lebanon, amid the Axis, and when it comes to the Houthis, they're like, "Oh no, what are Yemenis without their weapons?" You can't think about it that way. So I think disarmament language needs to be embedded right now because the biggest problem, especially with the Houthis, is that they are subjugating Yemeni tribes. Yemeni tribes are strong, dignified, and they're subjugating them with their weapons that they're getting smuggled from IRGC in Iran, and from all of the external backers that are helping them. So in Yemen, I think like asking arm groups to disarm before these questions are resolved are really, kind of also becomes unrealistic. From their perspective, it's irrational. But I think we need to sort of think about that. But also that doesn't mean that DDR is not relevant because it can't be imported wholesale from Kosovo or treated just as a template. It doesn't work in Yemen. Just like any process would needs to be localized, right? And I think the economic issue is a huge one, and I think it's one that we don't speak about. Yemen is poor, and it's also poorly managed. Um, I mean, even when the SDC had an opportunity to govern effectively, the ports didn't really function at any capacity. Electricity continued to be a problem. I mean, sewage was a problem. Cholera in Yemen, even in SDC held areas, like there's no elements of a functioning state. And then there's always this assumption that it's often Gulf states that need to pick up the tab for this. Well, right now, Yemen is kind of crippled because sort of like with Saudi Arabia taking over, I wonder what the UAE's incentive might be to helping Yemen economically. I mean, last year I think they announced one maybe a $1 billion fund or something like that. Fact check me on that. I'm not entirely sure, but but I don't know how what UAE's incentive would be to giving that, and especially when Yemenis are right now very proud in exposing what the UAE crimes that has happened over, like, I mean, you see all of this media circus that's happening right now where Saudis are accusing UAEs of atrocities, and then Yemenis on the side of UAE are accusing Saudis of atrocities, and vice versa, and it's just it's becoming just this volley between the two countries, and people are just falling. victims to this. And I think Yemen is becoming just the arena for this political fight, and real lives are being um, mismanaged. The economic situation needs seriousness. This moment needs seriousness. The stability of Yemen is important for both Saudi Arabia and the UAE, the region, and ironically, the world, the globe, ironically, Israel. So if we continue to just kind of like see it from that limited perspective, we're going to have a problem.
All right, Greg, anything to add?
No, I think Fatima hit it on the head. I mean, the thing about Kosovo is there was not just an external security provider, there was the external security provider, the United States and NATO. And fact check me on this one, but I think there are still NATO, including American troops in Kosovo. And so when you take on this kind of external security guarantor role, it can last longer than you think. And I think you know, it's it's one of these things that is hard sometimes to convey to folks in parts of the world like Yemen, that although for them, what happens in their country is the most important thing to them, and what happens in the region around them is they see as centrally important. Uh, in Washington, I would say there's no appetite for seeing Yemen as a centrally important geostrategic issue. And thus, the idea that there would be great power intervention diplomatically, even in a way that could perhaps move some kind of diplomatic process forward in Yemen, I think is highly unlikely. So it's different than Kosovo.
All right. Fatima, I do want to talk a little more about the STC specifically and other Yemeni secessionist groups. Um, First, did we lose Fatima? Oh, you're muted. Um, my question is, can we trust views on independence without opinion polling? Fatima, that's for you.
Sorry. Yes. It's hard to do opinion polling in a place where there is active conflict. But then, um, does opinion polling even, confer legitimacy? Would if people want to secede, I mean, by a national referendum, there are other security issues that come to mind. But currently, really, Yemen doesn't necessarily have the civic conditions, the institutional conditions, the security conditions that would make, any kind of opinion polling reliable. So, um, but there are other things that you can see, like, people are going to the street, they are demonstrating. But yes, like I'm very, very skeptical of anything like that happening. But I think there's another question that we need to think about, is that there's political unrest and turmoil in the South, and that the idea of a Southern identity is something that Southerners are bringing up repeatedly. I mean, to the extent that Riyadh has played the Southern national anthem just last week, right? And raised the Southern flag in Riyadh, and these were significant symbols. And we know that the South is not necessarily just one political community. You've got competing self-determination projects in the South itself. So you have Aden-centric secessionism, and you've got Hadrami autonomism. Yesterday we had an event with Dr. Saaduddin Talib, who was with the Presidium of Hadramaut, and he was passionately talking about that. You've got Mahri. Mahri is, they're particular and they're somewhat aligned with Oman, but they have their own local identity and they talk about that. So the Southern vision itself is not completely aligned, but all of the southern groups are secessionists. They all want to secede from the north. And I say this repeatedly. There's a difference between the northern and southern mentality in Yemen. The northerners are expansionists. They want to grab land. They want to go ahead and take as much. If you talk to Houthis, they want to go to Mecca and Israel, and they want to wipe Israel off the map. They want to be the custodian of the holy mosques, and they'll go to America. So the Houthis are expansionists, but the Southerners they just want to or the majority of the Southerners that I know and I interviewed and I worked with, they want to return to something that they can manage, a bit more technocratic and exclusionary in that sense. So when groups say that they claim to speak for the South, what they usually mean is that they speak for whatever constituency that they are, representing. There isn't necessarily a consensus. I don't know if it's important to have a consensus. I've even sometimes argued, and there's been pushback in the South-South dialogue that even if Hadramaut becomes its own kingdom, maybe the Aden-centric movement might be much more interested in lining up with Hadramaut than lining up with Sana'a because of shared identity, history, administrative history. They were all under the same situation and governance before 1990. So the Southerners often feel a sense of injustice, failure, compounded, and but their situation right now has massively changed from the way it was before. After the Houthis, their areas became the safe haven. So it's not as clean cut anymore. There are so many people in the north who live in the south. So you can't just, cut the artery and say Yemen just belongs or the south just belongs to the southerners because it's not as clean. And I think the STC, when Zubaydi was trying to have a transitional period of 2 years, maybe he was trying to fold in, that element of let's all live in a southern state, maybe have a South Korea to the North Korea that is imposed by the Houthis. So it's kind of like let's have that and let's live in it together. But that's not something that would have translated cleanly because transition comes with massive amounts of violence, you know, and not everybody can concede with that income of the South separating. So the Southerners will always have this unresolved issue, and the only way to sort of resolve it is to is really through economy. Like there's just no way around it. And once there's an equitable distribution of power, which I think was was the issue with the PLC, but once that is there with the economic management, if these two components are available, then you know conflict is less likely. I mean, there will be a less likelihood of that question surfacing up again. There would be no, I mean, it would eliminate the conditions that would make that question surface again.
All right. Greg, what are U.S. views on having a breakaway region in Yemen?
Historically, the United States has been against uh, breakaway a breakaway region in Yemen. It supported the Union, but truthfully, I don't think that this is an issue that engages top policymakers in Washington at all. We're in particularly in an administration now that is not well staffed, where foreign policy is very closely held in the hands of a few people in the White House, uh, which isn't particularly interested in kind of the normal policy process of regional expertise and the regional offices in the State Department working policy options through. And thus, I don't think Yemen gets on the agenda. Uh, Look, I think that the thing that might get on the agenda as it escalates is the UAE-Saudi confrontation, if we want to put it, or falling out. Uh, that I think is something that the U.S. and we know that Secretary Rubio has made some phone calls about this, but I think that the reason the U.S. is interested is not because of the facts on the ground in Yemen, but because these are two countries that the Trump administration, UAE and Saudi, the Trump administration sees as important economic partners, patrons, places where the Trump family can make money. That will drive American policy here, I fear.
And how likely, in your opinion, is Yemen to break along the 1990s borders today?
Well, I mean, like Fatima, my sense is that there's a fair amount of support for Southern autonomy, if not secession. But as she said, there's many different platforms of that desire, not a unified sense that the reconstitution of the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, from the 1970s and 80s is the answer. I agree that particularly if you go out to Hadramaut and Mahra, there might be some misgivings about that, and the notion of Hadrami autonomy has always been in the picture, and so. But forces on the ground, the main force on the ground pushing explicitly for Southern secession has been dealt an extreme setback, as Fatima laid out at the beginning of our hour, and thus there's no regional support at this moment for secession. The UAE has drawn back. We'll see what that means, a year from now. But the UAE has drawn back. Saudi Arabia has been very clear that it's not in favor of secession, and thus it's not on the board right now, right? The issue is just not on the table. Does that mean it will never be on the table? No, I don't want to say that, but it's certainly not on the table right now.
And I just would like completely agree with Greg here, because a couple of months ago, if you'd asked me, I would have thought it was real and it was gonna happen. Like that, it was inevitable a couple of months ago. And right now, it would almost take a miracle for it to actually be real. So we went into a complete shift, because things are just really fast accelerating on the ground, and just one miscalculation can throw things just completely off. So yeah, I agree with Greg there.
All right. Any concluding thoughts, Fatima?
Um, I'd say perhaps, in looking at this entire situation that is happening, I think like the biggest question is the UAE-Saudi fracture, and I think this is, I mean, it does sound big, but I still think that there are no big ideological differences between both actors. They're both driven by a different set of concerns. Saudi Arabia still wants to be in control of the situation, and what has unfolded through the STC's advances in Yemen has kind of challenged that authority, and Saudi Arabia was just reasserting its red lines. Um, uh, I think that the situation in Yemen currently is being exploited by the Houthis. They're exploiting all of this chaos. luckily, it's not translating into any kind of battlefield successes for them or any appetite for them to move. But it is depriving the coalition from, it's shifting its coalition gaze from something really important, which is sustaining pressure on the Houthis, because right now they're just pressuring each other.
All right, Greg?
MEI is going to have a closed seminar tomorrow on the UAE-Saudi split, and that'll be very interesting. I'll be tuning into that. But like Fatima, I think that uh, the split has more implications for Yemen than any other place in the world. And those implications we're seeing on the ground. Uh, I I think that a lot of what's happening in the South is, I think, the result of a sense in the South that the Saudis were sleeping on the South for a long time, that they had lost their focus on the South, that they were very much concentrated on the Houthis and dealing with the Houthis, and that might have opened up a window. But historically, the Saudis have always seen Yemen as their preserve, and they've always been against any outsider, and that includes the Emirates, that includes Iran, any outsider taking a role in Yemen. They see as a direct threat to their security. And I think Riyadh just kind of woke up to what was going on in the South in a way that they had lost focus on when the STC made this daring grab at power. That, as I said earlier, I don't think it was irrational, but it was really risky. And as Fatima said, the risks, the bet didn't pay off for them.
All right. Unfortunately, we've reached the end of our webinar. A huge thank you to the audience and to our speakers, Fatima Abul Asrar, Gregory Gaz, for their time and valuable insights. I hope you enjoyed today's discussion, and we'll see you next time.